everybody. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors and the director of the Real Estate Academy of America. Continuing on with our series on the changes that the Georgia Association of Realtors, or GAR, has made to their contract package for 2025. Please check in the description below for links to all the other videos I have done in this series, along with a link to the Real Estate Academy of America, where we are teaching free 3-hour CE classes on these changes. So today's topic, as I told you in the overview, there are 9 new forms that GAR has created for us for 2025. We have already covered several of those in the previous videos. As a reminder, you guys want a reminder? I'll give you a reminder. The 9 new forms and 1 new brochure are the F117, seller's broker's notice to an unrepresented buyer, the F118, showing agreement. Those are the 2 forms I'm going to talk about in today's video. The F317, buyer's broker's notice to the seller of the seller's obligations regarding lead-based paint. F318, seller's broker's notice to seller of seller's obligations regarding lead-based paint. We've already addressed those. F846, visitor's sign-in sheet and disclaimer. F847, viewing a house under construction. We've already addressed those. The next 3 forms have to do with a lease. F935, application for a reasonable accommodation or modification. F936, policy to allow reasonable accommodation and modification for persons with disabilities exhibit. And F937, response to a request for a reasonable accommodation of persons with disabilities exhibit. I'll cover those in another video. And the new brochure, the CB29, which I have also covered. That is what buyers, sellers, and realtors need to know about buying agricultural land and land near military bases, installations, and airports. So we have knocked out in other videos all of the other new forms, except for the 2 I'm going to talk about today, and those 3 forms that go with a lease. I'm going to do another video on the 2025 changes that GAR made to the lease and those new forms. But today's video, we are going to discuss the F117, seller's broker's notice to unrepresented buyer, and the F118, showing agreement. So let me share my screen and we shall dive in. As always, thank you so much for your time, and please subscribe so you don't miss any of these videos or any future videos on all sorts of contract tips, license law, code of ethics, and the like. So here we go. Let's dive in, and we are going to start with this brand new GAR form F117, seller's broker's notice to unrepresented buyer. So first thing you do is you fill in the name of the buyer. This notice, we know when we see the word notice, it means it only requires 1 signature. It only requires your signature as the broker giving notice to the buyer. And as you've heard me teach repeatedly in my classes, the easiest way to remember that a notice only requires 1 signature is you think back to history that you learned in elementary school and the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. And you heard that Paul Revere rode his horse through Boston yelling, giving notice, a 1 man, 1 horse, giving notice. The British are coming, the British are coming, posting up notice on all of the buildings and the posts in Boston. So he's giving notice, hammering notice, 1 man, 1 horse. Notice requires 1 signature. You will never forget that now. So, seller's broker's notice to unrepresented buyers. So, first of all, it is the seller's broker, not the buyer's broker, but this seller's broker. So, the broker and affiliated licensee working with the seller. Notice to an unrepresented buyer. So, you fill out the name of the buyer, and that the name of the brokerage or the affiliated licensee, hence the broker, is representing the seller as a client. I guess that really should be the name of the brokerage, in marketing the following property for sale and not representing the buyer. And then you fill in the property address. This document goes on to say, as the broker for the seller, broker is permitted to perform ministerial acts on behalf of the unrepresented buyer, such as showing the buyer the property and acting as a scribe in the preparation of real estate form contracts. Buyer in bold print and all caps and a bigger font. Buyer is responsible for protecting buyer's own interests if buyer decides to purchase the property. Broker directs the buyer to review the ABCs of agency, which is GAR Consumer Brochure 01, and hereby notifies buyer that they have the right to engage their own representation at the buyer's expense. And then you fill out the name of the brokerage firm, the name, the signature of the broker or affiliated licensee, the date, type the name, Georgia license number, phone number, so forth and so on. And you are delivering this in person via email, fax, so forth and so on. Again, the buyer's signature is not required because this is a notice, not an agreement. So, couple of thoughts. When would you use this? Well, as I always say in my videos, you definitely need to check with your broker on when your broker would prefer that you use this form. But consider an agent having both sides of a transaction, but not necessarily dual agency. So the agent or the broker would be working with the seller as a client and would work with the buyer as a customer. Now, as you know, in Georgia, a public person who does not sign a brokerage agreement is by default a customer. GAR has a buyer customer acknowledgement, buyer's agreement to work with broker as customer, that describes the customer or relationship between them and the broker. But sometimes a buyer won't sign that. Or perhaps at an open house. So again, this is just putting the buyer who is not working with an agent or broker on notice that you are allowed to perform ministerial acts, but you are the agent. You do have a client relationship with the seller. Now, just as a reminder, well, as a good point of practice, for you as a real estate agent here in Georgia, let me show you that GAR form, the ABCs of agency. And there is a form, a document that we have put together at the Real Estate Academy of America on ministerial acts that, as a point of practice, might be a good idea to share with any unrepresented buyer. Again, always check with your broker before using any form that you hear in any class. So let me share my screen and let me show you. This is that form, Ministerial Acts. And this is a compilation of information, what constitutes a ministerial act in the state of Georgia with respect to real estate, from the GREC newsletter from 2021, as well as from Beretta laws and what examples of ministerial acts are, as well as Georgia Rule 520-1-.02. So this is just a really good document to have with you as a real estate agent in Georgia and to share with any buyer who chooses to be a customer in any transaction. I just think it's a good go along document with this new 2025 form. And of course, this is the GAR Consumer Brochure 01, the ABCs of Agency, Understanding Real Estate Brokerage Relationships in Georgia. And it defines what a client relationship is with a broker, what that means, and how a public person can become a client. So again, that is this form, new form for GAR 2025 Seller Broker's Notice to Unrepresented Buyer. Now, let's move along to another new form for 2025 that GAR has. The showing agreement, and this is F118, brand new for 2025, showing agreement. And GAR is giving us information right off the bat, not to be used by seller's broker. Do not use this if you are, these are my notes to you guys. Do not use this if you are a listing agent showing your listing to an unrepresented buyer, because you are getting paid by the seller, and you'll see why I say that in just a minute. So again, showing agreement. For and in consideration of $10, another good and valuable consideration, the receipt and sufficiency of which is hereby acknowledged, the undersigned real estate broker and undersigned buyer do hereby agree the following. Number one, showing agreement. Broker agrees to show buyer the following property or properties listed below to the buyer without owing any compensation. Broker is not being paid compensation by the sellers of the below listed properties. Compensation is negotiable and is not set by state law. So this is why you don't use it if you are a seller's broker, because you are getting compensated by the seller, so you would not use this. Number two, broker shall perform limited services. Broker is only agreeing to show the buyer the property or properties below. If the buyer needs additional brokerage services, buyer will need to enter into a separate agreement for that with the broker. Three, broker's agency relationship with the buyer. Broker is not representing buyer in a client capacity. Instead, buyer shall only be a customer of the broker. This means that the broker will not give professional advice to the buyer and will only perform ministerial acts for the buyer. Buyer shall be solely responsible for protecting buyer's interests. Buyer should review the ABCs of agency to learn more about how the buyer can work with the broker. And hazardous conditions on property. Buyer basically acknowledges there are potentially hazardous conditions, and the buyer's family members and representatives need to avoid injury and look out and be careful and be alert for step downs, poorly lit areas, so forth and so on. A hold harmless statement and a fair housing acknowledgement that the buyer acknowledges that the broker is committed to providing equal housing opportunities to all persons. While the broker may show properties of a type or in any specific geographical area requested by the buyer, the broker may not steer buyers to or away from particular areas based upon race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And then you itemize the property addresses of the buyer, of the properties you are going to show a buyer. And this does get the signature of the affiliated licensee and the buyer. Again, this is a showing agreement only for $0, no compensation whatsoever. So those are the two new forms. I showed you also the add-ons, the GAR Consumer Brochure, the ABCs of Agency, and that form, the Ministerial Acts. I'll link that in the description below as a bonus for you. And I hope this contract tip helped you out on continuing on with the series on the new forms, the changes that GAR has made to the 2025 contract package. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.